Okay, so for this short lecture, we're going to focus on Laos and refugees from Laos, which includes Laotians and Hmong refugees. Now, the Hmong in particular, because the Hmongs, hundreds of thousands of Hmongs were recruited to fight uh, in this war in Laos, and what happened in Laos as well as in Cambodia was that the U.S. never officially declared war in Laos or in Cambodia, and the activities that were activities that were conducted in quote unquote secret. That's why many talk about the secret war in Laos. And so American soldiers were never truly deployed, and the only military personnel from the U.S. Who were used in the war were used only to train Laotians and Hmong for fighting. Some of them even trained in the U.S. in military camps in the U.S. and uh, and the U.S. base um, for um, for much of the training was just across the border in Thailand. But again, many came to the U.S. as well. The ones that would be like leaders of the Laotian army. So why were the Hmong in particular recruited? So and so the Hmong were recruited because they were effective for fighting in the highlands of Laos, meaning in the jungles of Laos. And so they would be able to penetrate, the Ho Chi Minh Trail that went through Laos and into Cambodia. Now, what were they promised for fighting for the U.S.? They were promised food, medical supply, and of course weapons. And in the future, if they were successful in pushing the North Vietnamese forces back, Americans would help as much as possible, help Laos as much as possible. And if they suffered a defeat, the Americans would find a new home, a new place for the Hmong to live. And of course, that new place you can all guess would be America, because they would come here as refugees. Um, so, how did their decision to take part in America's communist containment effort affect their living condition and subsequently their future? So, more than 100,000 Hmong had to be evacuated from their villages as the war intensified, because the war destroyed their farms, and so the Hmong were completely relying on American food supply. The population um, the population were not literate, were not had very low levels of education, and so when U.S. forces withdrew from Vietnam in April 30th, 1975, and the communist forces took power in Laos, the Pathet Lao, and communist forces took power in Vietnam as well with the Viet Cong, and then Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. But when that happened, anyone who fought for America would be subject to immediate death and persecution. And so the Hmong, when the U.S. withdrew, were a target of the communist regime, and therefore the U.S. had to do something in order to save the uh, Hmong refugees who assisted the U.S. in during the Vietnam War. So there were policies that came about that allowed Hmong refugees starting in the 1980s to come to the U.S. as refugees, along with Vietnamese and Cambodian refugees. And Vietnamese, by this time, are ethnic Chinese Vietnamese mainly. And unfortunately, much like the Cambodians and much like the ethnic Chinese Vietnamese who came to the US during this period of the early 1980s and throughout the 80s and into the early 1990s. They came during a time of economic recession, and so there was a systematic underfunding of resources and allocation for resettlement, for healthcare and mental health care. And for Hmong American, it took a while, and for Hmong and Laotian American, it took a while for the U.S. government to even acknowledge that they helped serve the U.S. and to grant many of them naturalized citizenship for fighting for the U.S. During this war. And it wasn't until the 1990s and into the 2000s that a memorial for the Laotian and for the Hmong veterans were created in Washington, D.C., along with the Vietnam War Memorial that was created much earlier on. So, the Hmong refugees and Laotian refugees did suffer similar forms of racialization as Cambodians and the Chinese Vietnamese refugees because they came during a time of economic recession, and the policies during that time made them dependent on U.S. Welfare system, and they were put into urban ghettos with poor schools. So that created a class of underachievers, and uh, this reality is not helped by Asian Americans being viewed as a racialized model minority who all do well in school and all do well in math and sciences. And so, because of that racialized stereotype of Asian Americans as a model minority, Hmong, Cambodian, and some Vietnamese Americans have not been able to get the resources that they need in order to achieve uh, uh, well in school and in order to overcome the structural limitations that they have been placed within since immigrating to the US as refugees in the 1980s.